Welcome to Beyond the Portrait. I am truly delighted to share this next conversation with you with my guest, Asha Frost. Asha is an Indigenous medicine woman, and her medicine name quite literally means healing rainbow woman, and she is a rainbow bridge. And when I mean rainbow bridge, I mean it in a symbolic sense, because Asha is able to hold space for conversations. She's able to hold the nuance to create more connectedness. In a world that is becoming increasingly more separate, I think that we need to hear from voices who are able to hold space, have boundaries, and also have an open heart, because the goal is to create a more connected world. And I think if everyone could learn from Asha, our world would be a vastly superior place. So without further ado, Asha Frost. I'm so excited to see you. So I'm going to have you introduce yourself, say your name, where you live, what you do, all the things.
Okay. Hello, my given name is Asha. My spirit name is Nadaiwakaganokwe, Healing Rainbow Woman, and also Wida Adun Enenkipa, which is She Who Walks a Path of the Thunderbirds. I am from Anishinaabe in Dunjaba, which is Cape Croker First Nation on my mother's side, Serpent River First Nation on my father's side, all from so-called Ontario. I'm currently in Newmarket, Ontario, on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I am a medicine woman, a speaker, an author, an oracle deck creator, a mama. And yeah, I'm here to dream a world into being for the next 7 generations to come. Hopefully walking with Minabamadzawin, which means in Anishinaabe Moen, to walk in a good way. I identify as Anishinaabe Kwe, which is an Indigenous woman. So my pronouns are she, her.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm so excited about this. It's something that I've been wanting to have this conversation. And when we did our shoot, it's been something that I had been wanting to do for years. And so it was such a treat to get to meet you in person and to get to be able to celebrate like my birthday week up in Canada with you. And I'm so happy we get to have this conversation. So I mentioned a little bit offline, but when we were preparing for this conversation, so for the listener, Asha has written a very beautiful book, and I happen to have it with me. It's You Are the Medicine. So for the video people, you can look. And I also have her deck, the Sacred Medicine Oracle deck. And I love both of these products. So the book is just really beautiful and really meaningful. And the decks, I use her cards like literally on the daily. Like I love them so very much. And so in prepping for today, I was doing what I normally do, which is, prepping. And I pulled the Peaceful Warrior card. And I would love to hear what that means to you, because I know that's particularly special for you.
It is. Yeah, the energy of that came forward when 2020 happened, around that time when I was in social justice spaces, and rightly so. I was sharing my Indigenous voice and really sharing about how people can learn the history and how people can become allies. So trying to bring non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people together. And my true nature is quite sensitive, and I'd say more on the quiet side, perhaps, maybe a little bit shy, maybe a little bit introverted. And I really wrestled with how to be in those spaces and places and be a voice there, and maybe not be the loudest in the room, or maybe not be the one that said things in a certain way. I tended to come in those spaces still with a very gentle, open heart, energy, but very firm with boundaries. So I seemed to be almost outside what I was observing and witnessing in those spaces. And I kept shaming myself, thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like that? And that person's really getting a lot of attention. And of course, they seem to be like the voice of the expert, and that's not my way. So I had to reflect a lot about what my true nature is and how I can show up in these spaces, still being me, not having to feel like I had to be anyone else or any other way. So I think that we can all be warriors in our own way. And for some of us, that also intersects with peace. So peaceful warrior to me is still standing for something, standing your ground, speaking with courage, being in your power, and maybe doing it in a little bit of a different way than we see from the loudest voices. There's nothing wrong with those. We need those too, but it's a bit different.
I think it's a really beautiful message that everybody can participate and everybody's voice is needed. But it's like, but we all have different ways of doing things. And that the end goal is
Mhm.
that we're trying to help the planet and help the world. And I think what's so beautiful about your book and so beautiful about your cards is it's so much about everyone is welcome and we need all of the players. And like one of the beautiful parts about the moons in particular, which I'll have you talk about, is each one is represented by an animal and how much we can learn from nature. And so what would you want to say about that? I mean, not obviously I want everyone to read your book, so we don't have to go into everything exactly in the book, but I think in terms of like feeling separate versus the collective, like what can we learn, I think, from nature and the animals.
Yeah, I love that we're all needed. I think that we are in a very individualistic society and we forget that we're in community. And the way we're going to move forward is through that community energy and through relating to one another. So I think what we're seeing now on social media is a lack of that, a lack of relating heart to heart, spirit to spirit. Yes, we need to share the truth. Yes, we need to speak up, all of those things. But then what? Then when it all falls, how are we going to relate to one another? And so I do believe creation teaches us that, how the bees relate to the flowers and the plants relate to the sun and everything, all of creation does relate to one another. How can we learn from that? How can we look outside and say, oh my goodness, if they were in a fight right now, or if they had opposing viewpoints, what would happen, right? How could they relate with one another? You know, how would the wind move through the trees? Like I think about that a lot. And I think that it's a lesson and a teaching needed right now because there's so much division and there's so much, I'm right, you're wrong, binary thinking, black and white. I love the option of a third way, or just a different opening up and expanding our viewpoints to allow others to rest in our hearts as well and contemplate those. With regards to the moons, my book is based on the 13 moons. And we have 13 moon cycles in our calendar year, or Gregorian calendar. And that 13 moon got snuffed out by colonization. I'd heard that it was a Mi'kmaq elder that shared that the 13 moon got erased because it was actually a woman's moon. So I think that's interesting. That powerful woman's moon got erased. And then we went to this 12 moon calendar year. So bringing back the 13 moons is really important. And when I wrote it, there's specific Ojibwe teachings around each of those moons that would be relevant to where I live or my ancestors live. Now, of course, we know Indigenous people are not a monolith. So across Turtle Island, there are many different traditions, ways of being and knowing and celebrating. And I wrote this book for everyone, hoping or inviting people, may my words and my teachings activate your own. May we relate to one another. Again, relationship being, how can you relate to these teachings? And what does that remind you of? How can you remember in your own way the wisdom that's in your cells and your bones? So those 13 moons came out as teachers almost and as invitations to your own wisdom and bringing that forward. And then the animal beings, I would ask, which animal wants to be related to this moon? Those weren't handed down. Those weren't taught. Those were from spirit. I asked what wanted to come forward. And those animal spirits came forward again as wisdom keepers and as beings that are going to share all of this beauty, I think, with the world. So that's how that book came together.
Well, it's a really lovely book, and I think that, I'd read it a couple of years ago, and then I decided to start rereading it, and I read almost the whole thing again in one day because before when I read it, I did it in increments because I wanted it to kind of line up with the moons, and then like over the past week, I like just kind of like was like, actually, I need to read it again, so I read it in one day, and because it was so, and then I was like, all of this like there's so much wisdom in this book and things that I was like, oh, I wasn't able to hear some of this before and now I can. And that's like the beauty of books, right? Is you pick up things that you maybe wouldn't have picked up before. But I've been thinking a lot about nature and how we have to work together because with the mycelium networks and things like that, like the trees and things like they don't have to be the same species, but they will know when something is going on in the forest, and they will all send resources to that tree, whether that's the same species or not of, similar tree, or a different plant, or, and I've been thinking a lot about it because of what's going on in our world, because our world is dying, and it's because we have separated from the earth and we have separated from each other. And so I think that that's why I think your messages are particularly poignant right now, because who else knows how to take care of this planet than our indigenous brothers and sisters and families? It's like, and that's where we need to get this information from. So I wanted to go back. So I think I told you before that this was a time capsule that I'm trying to kind of have like a bit of the past and the present and the future. And but I was realizing, like, by starting it the same way every time, that might get a little bit dull. But I do want to talk a little bit about, because it is such a part of your story. You had told me that growing up, your family had tried to assimilate into kind of like white culture. And that was a great part because of the trauma from the residential schools and just living where you lived, and that's, I think, common for people with your background. And I think also if you have like immigrants that are, I guess, non-white cultures. So a lot of my Japanese friends have felt the same way, Korean friends. So I want you to talk to me a little bit about what that was like growing up, and like, because you were able to then reclaim your heritage, which I think is a big part of your gift.
Yeah, well, we were, I think, my sister and I, the only Indigenous people in our school, in our elementary school. And then in our high school, we had some cousins that were there. So that was nice, but we really were the only ones. And it wasn't like my mom didn't try to surround us with Indigenous culture or our teachings. She did it in a very gentle way. And we knew we were Indigenous. But it was at that time in the 80s, there was so much racism. And it was something that inherently somehow I felt as a child I didn't want to be. This was not a good thing. This was not something I was proud of. So I would hide those aspects of myself. And I remember deliberately putting earrings away and putting them at the bottom of my jewelry drawer or anything beaded. I didn't want to have that be part of who I was. And I didn't even know why, which is sort of sad how racism can become so insidious, because it wasn't like a lot of people really said to me, until my teenage years, like, oh my goodness, it's so bad that you're Indigenous or anything like that. I just knew. And maybe that was passed down generationally as well, right? Through my parents' trauma. So growing up, I grew up in a very white neighborhood, a very white school. And yeah, I think that was safety for my parents. I think they saw that as a safe choice. And it probably was very safe for what they wanted for my life. So it wasn't until I was 17 that when I got sick, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness. And that was the awakening or the remembering of what was in my blood and bones the whole time. And I'd been dreaming, I'd been seeing, I was a seer when I was really little. Spirits and ancestors would come into my room, and I thought it was normal, or I just didn't question it. And when I went on my healing journey, I started to realize, oh, they've been talking to me this whole time. They are directing me in a new direction of how I can heal and bringing me back to the land and the earth and the spirit world ultimately. And it's been a long journey ever since.
Yeah. Well, so we both have autoimmune diseases. So I think that's also why your book meant so much to me, because not only do I have one, but also my mom does. And so I think that kind of separation from self, it does show up in the body. And, I've learned a lot about epigenetics. And so I'm absolutely positive that your generational trauma is kind of like, it did show up in a physical form. So let's talk about, like, so growing up, and I think you also had mentioned before that your mom was really good about helping because you were sensitive. And I think as a healer, like, you have to feel so much. And so it's like, so how does that work as someone who's a highly sensitive person? Like, for one, how are you able to protect yourself? Because that's a lot to take in. And two, like, how is your kind of upbringing and kind of like working through being highly sensitive? How has that kind of shown up, and like how you've been able to kind of harness that as a power?
Yeah, my mom, I should credit her a lot with that because she really advocated for my sensitive soul. I think she ultimately is a sensitive being and knew that, but didn't have those parents that nurtured that or cared for that. So she really did. She stuck up for me when the teachers would say, oh, Ash is so shy and so quiet. We want her to participate more, or whatever the thing was. She would just stick up for me and say, well, this is just not our Indigenous way. And she'd bring our ways of being and knowing into the spaces, which was really beautiful. And I remained I still am so sensitive, not as much as when I was little. I dropped out of kindergarten. The world was too dense and too intense for me. And I couldn't, I think I felt things so deeply and I took them in and then they just weigh on my heart. And when I became a healer, I realized that was my biggest gift. But I would go and see all these other healers and they'd say, Asha, you have to stop healing people that way. You cannot leap into somebody's body and feel what they're feeling and then, heal them. And I didn't know any other way for the longest time. And I knew that's why I was good at what I did, because I could sit in front of somebody. I could energetically kind of come in, and I was a homeopath. So I would just know what flavor and energy and, just the potency of what they needed was. I could feel it so deeply in my own body. And that was my radar. So it took me a long time to realize that probably wasn't the best for me always to do it that way. I still end up doing that sometimes because it's my natural state again of doing that. And that's how I relate to somebody sometimes, with permission, of course. I never leaping into people's energy fields without that permission. But that's how I learned how to do it. And so protection became a huge teacher for me, how to be more boundaried, and really it was about like finding out where my own inner boundaries were. Where was I being stepped over, stepped upon? Where was my voice not being heard? Where was I not speaking? Where did I not feel safe to speak? So it's been a lot of, I think, work around boundaries, and that really provided better protection for me. However, I realized I've been doing a new way of eating, and I've had some events with lots of people, and usually I'm pretty wiped after because I just take it in. But I realized the way I'm eating right now is actually helping me. It's providing more protection. So that's been an interesting growth point here at 47 years old, that there's something that's changing with my energetic protection just from what I'm putting into my body.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think when we were doing our shoot, you kind of told me and what you were going to be doing. And it's, for me, I tried being a vegetarian and I couldn't do it. And I had an Eastern medicine doctor tell me, she checked my pulse and she's like, you have no life force. She's like, for some people it's good for you, but it's not good for you. Like you have to eat more protein and you have to eat more animals. And it was interesting because, I think when you have an autoimmune disease, like our bodies handle things differently. And I think so much of it, like your body's constantly in fight or flight. Like there's so much, you need so much energy. Like I have to eat so much more food than other people do. And it's because my body's like always at the ready. And so it's interesting, like learning how to put yourself first when you are someone who gives and gives and gives. And I can imagine for you, especially as like a healer, that's, it's a beautiful thing to like learn how to live in the and. I think that for me, I'm learning how to live in the and. How can both things be true? What would you like to say about living in the and?
I feel like I live there a lot. I don't know if that's part of my true nature. Perhaps I was born with nuance. I'm not sure. But when I look around collectively, I think I don't fit into that side or that side. Maybe it's my spirit name, Healing Rainbow Woman, being a bridge. Being a bridge, you have one foot into both worlds and you need to dance in both of them and navigate both. And I do tend to be the type of person who says, I'm going to look at this and read everything about this side. And then I'm going to look at this and read everything about this side, because I want to be as open-minded and hearted as I possibly can to see what rings true perhaps for me, but also not be rigid. Rigidity tends to really trigger me. So that might be that rainbow dancer moving between both worlds. Yeah. And I think that living in the nuance is part of my medicine.
100%. 100%. I think this is a good time to talk about your essay. So the Dear White Woman essay blew up the internet. And, I think that it was such a powerful essay, and it's also in the book, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I would love to talk to you about that and like kind of how you kind of came to the point that you wanted to use your voice, and how kind of like what happened and what that felt like when you pressed send, because you're such a kind, nice human. That was probably terrifying to hit enter, send. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I think I was at capacity for what I was witnessing and what I was feeling. And we know, living with chronic conditions, our bodies will ultimately tell us. They might tell us for a long, long time we don't listen, but then it becomes to a point where we can't not listen. And that's where I was. I was in a space for the last 10 years, witnessing white women in our communities dressing up in Indigenous wear and teaching drum songs and wearing ribbon skirts and doing things that were just, I think what was the hardest part is the trauma that I hadn't yet worked through to feel worthy of even sharing that on my own, because our ceremonies were buried and they were illegal, and because of the history. And then seeing white women just take them with ease without having to navigate that layer of trauma in between felt really harmful. And this was before the conversations of cultural appropriation really became mainstream. It was right at the edge. It was right before 2020 happened. So the collective they were really favoring white women's spirituality, white women new age, everything. That was who was successful, and that was who was thriving, and that was who were the 7-figure businesses. So I, at the time, felt quite hidden, and I had a private practice in my home. I was well known in my own local community, but not really anywhere else. And so when I put that on my blog, it was a blog I had at the time that maybe a couple hundred people read. I posted it from there, and I would post my link to my Instagram to read my latest blog. And it went viral really fast. So I didn't actually think, oh my gosh, should I press this? Because I thought, well, the people that are going to read this are pretty much know who I am.
Yeah.
But then when it went viral, then I had to just hold on tight and take a breath. And I remember one of my best friends, she was the one who really talked and walked me through this, because she had heard me crying on the phone to her all the time about all of this, and she'd hear me shaking. And so her and my husband would check like my blog to see how many times it was shared. They kept like checking and telling me, and because I couldn't look myself. So it was an expression of what had been rattling me for so long. And I feel like I did it with my true nature, which is still a peaceful warrior. I warriored in the fact that it was like courage and rooted and fiery, and also from heart. It was directly from my heart. And it was an invitation, relatable, right? How can we relate to one another again? And I think because on a whole society doesn't know how to do that, it's either like, I'm going to fight with you and I'm going to fight back. It's no, I want to build a relationship here. That's how I know we're going to build truth and reconciliation. That's how I know we're going to mend. Without you, I can't mend this. Without me, you can't mend this. So how do we build a relationship? That's really what the purpose of that was. And of course, it doesn't land that way for everybody. People get very defensive, very upset. So that's what happened. I'd say 50% of people, again, the nuance, 50% of the people got very upset and mad at me and just wrote all these scathing emails. Then 50% of the people thought, wow, this really touched something. Thank you for writing this. And I didn't expect all of that.
Well, I think it was really brave. And I think for someone like, I am a white woman who has loved learning about Indigenous practices, and I use them on the daily. And it's something where I was noticing that people who looked like me were hijacking practices. And I think because of my past as a former Mormon, Mormons are in particular a religion that does a lot of missionary work in other cultures, and not just other cultures, but I don't know how much you know about Mormons, but there's a lot about Indigenous communities in the scriptures and kind of the harm that has been done to Indigenous communities. And, I think that for me, it's like, because it wasn't that far, even in my own family. There was a program, it was kind of like the residential schools in a way, where they would bring in Indigenous children to come live with white Mormon families. And my own grandparents did that. And my mom had what they would call like a Lamanite sister. And I have a lot of shame about it, because it makes me really, really sad. It's like, and I think, it's interesting because I think a lot of white people, and white women in particular, there's the thing about white women tears, right? And I think it's because we've had the privilege of not having to learn those survival skills of regulating our emotions. And I think that when you are someone who has been marginalized or harmed, you've had to learn how to manage those things. But you've also had to kind of hide. And, I think part of why I feel so strongly about what I want to do on this podcast is I'm trying to create reparations by sharing people's stories, because when you love people, you would treat them better. And I think that it's that whole like being a part of the collective. Like there has been so much harm that has been created because of certain systems. And I think that, it's like, it's one of those things where I don't want to be a culture vulture, and that's colonialism, right? Where you go in and you go and I've traveled with people like through work where I've had to travel and they would go to cultures and they just kind of eat the food, but they don't kind of like embrace the culture. And what I loved about your essay is you want what is the beauty of my culture, but are you willing to hold space for the harm? And I think that is such an important distinguisher, because you can't hold space if you just take and take and take. And how do we amplify voices and give back to the communities? Because what's done is done, but how do we move forward? And how do we hold space for the people that we have harmed? And yes, it wasn't me specifically, but it's in my DNA. It's my DNA has contributed to this. And so I don't know. I think that it was such a powerful thing that you wrote. And I'm not surprised that you got pushed back, because people like me who look like me can't handle it sometimes. And, I think for anyone who's listening to this, who is feeling a little bit triggered right now, I would just ask you to sit with it, because it is the truth. And we have to live on this earth together. And we have to be able to, everybody has the right to feel safe and welcomed and free to live whoever they want and to be. And it's, anyway, I sometimes go on rants. so rant over. But I mean, so
Yeah.
what would you like to say about that?
Well, how you said, yeah, it wasn't me who did this. And that's the thing. It's true, true, true. And how are you profiting off of different cultures? How are you making those seven-figure businesses, right? And not acknowledging, I'm fine for people to make money. I love money. I think that's great. And what's hard sometimes is to see was to see really these white women having these huge businesses, and they'd be using their sage and like just using it just as their like marketing tools or whatever these things are that just felt like extractive. They'd extract that part and then not even do those reparations or think about Indigenous communities and how we couldn't practice those practices not even that long ago. Like my grandparents couldn't, like that's a very close story of mine. So that was the hardest thing, is like feeling extracted from and then invisible. You're invisible. We're going to extract from you, but then we're just going to hide you all and not acknowledge what's going on in our northern communities where there's no running water, clean running water, or there's high rates of suicide. Well, get it together, get over it. Why is that? How is the generational harm passed on? And why are communities the highest communities that are incarcerated, or the suicide rate so high in our youth, or we don't have menstrual products? There's so many issues that people don't know about, and they just want to say like, oh, I'll just take the pretty things and I'll just use this and I'll ignore everything else. And that's really what's hard, because that's happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still happening. It's still happening. And I think that's why we have to talk about it, because we can't heal something that we are hiding under the rug. And what I think learned recently is you can't get over anything. What ends up happening is it gets repressed, which is what causes illness, which is why I think I have illness. It's like, because when you repress, you can't get over it. You have to go through it. And that's the difference. You can't just kind of pressure it down, because it will come out. And that's why I think our world is so toxic, because we have to heal this. Like we can't keep doing this. We can't ravage from our earth. We can't ravage from people. We can't turn a blind eye. And I think that it's that living in the and. We have to be able to talk about the harm, because we have to repair it, and then everyone benefits. It's like, I think that, the analogy of the trees, like living in the forest, it's like, we're all part of this forest, and there's part of the forest that needs help. How do we send resources to that part of the forest? It's like, that's kind of my goal. So what I also love too about the bridge that is part of your name and your healing name is, and part of what's great about this letter is it wasn't shaming. And I think that that's like the beautiful part about your voice, is it doesn't shame people who want to take part of the practices. It's more asking questions. Like, have you considered what this cost is to someone like me? Have you considered like like how to use this with more reverence. And I think that that's the balance, right? Being the bridge. It's like you're inviting people to learn from Indigenous communities and Indigenous practices, but you're asking for reverence. So anyway, I've done way too much talking. So what would you like to say about that?
Yeah, well, thank you for that reflection. That's how I intend it to land, and that's how I intend it to be used. And it's interesting. I mean, something we could talk about is when my deck came out, there were so many people that asked me, like, am I allowed to use this? And I thought that was fascinating because it was published by a really big spiritual publishing house. It's available everywhere. Of course, you can buy it and use it. So I thought that was interesting because you would never ask a white woman appropriating other cultures if you could buy their thing, right? And we hear support Indigenous creators and businesses, and yet people were so, oh my gosh, can I do this? And afraid to go there. So I find that there's something underneath that for me where I think, oh, it's interesting how we get to just like extractive practices. And yeah, we're going to go to that white woman and buy that. That person's taken all of these teachings and woven them into their own whatever creation. But yet when the authentic person does it, then you're like, I don't know. Should I buy it? Should I spend money on that? I'm not sure. So that's something that's really interesting for me to observe since my deck came out.
Absolutely. I think that that's how you know that white supremacy has really, really gotten into about perfectionism. And I think that people can't hold space for mistakes. And I know I'm going to make mistakes. I know I'm going to do the wrong thing sometimes. And I'm going to, because the programming is deep, it's like, and so even, I think this is something that's interesting about racism too. It doesn't always mean that you hate people to still have problems of the system, right? And so I think I have heard people say this, and I think because I am white, people say it because they're like, well, you look like me, so I can say this to you. And it is very much like, oh, well, I don't want to appropriate. And it's like, okay, but like they're not saying that you can't do the things. They're saying don't hijack practices and underpay people and then like profit immensely. Like that's the problem. It's like it's because I think Indigenous communities are very open-hearted. Like that's the beauty of your medicine and of your gift is like you can hold space. You've had to learn that skill. Like I like that's your gift. You've had to learn that. Like I think so one of the other cards that I pulled, which maybe this is a good time to talk about it, and it's a card that I've pulled almost daily for about a month, and then I did a bunch of card pulls yesterday, and it's one of the ones that I've been pulling, and it's your mosaic card. And I've been thinking a lot about wholeness. And I think, we've been talking a little bit already about like isolation versus separation. And I think I use a lot of analogies, and I think that that's why I like the mosaic, because it's something that I think people can understand. And it's and I think especially too, like what shows up in the physical world also shows up in our internal world. And I think that's also why it shows up in our health, right? So it's like we can't be separate. We have all of the pieces, and our nature has to have all of the pieces, like, and each person has a voice to play, but it's that wholeness. It's the collective. It's the separation. It's the isolation that's the problem. And so I think it's interesting that white women are like, oh, I'm afraid to buy your card deck, but I'm totally fine like buying it at like Aloe or, or like going to some of these other places. And I think it's that perfectionism. It's that I'm so afraid to make mistakes that I can't have the conversation, that I can't like, and they're so afraid that they're going to do something wrong or that they're going to get canceled. And I know you talk about cancel culture a lot. So what would you advise for people on how to navigate that? Because I think I'm not the person to be talking about it. So
I think what you said was true, like seeing it as a product of white supremacy, which we're all marinating in, myself included. Of course, I've taken anti-racist trainings. I've done some of that work because I know that I'm marinating in this white supremacy culture. So I'm not exempt from doing any of that work because, of course, there's many things that exist in me, these biases that I need to examine and meet every single day. I really try to do that. And of course, I'm not perfect either. So seeing that perfectionism as that product of white supremacy that we're all marinating in. So if you can practice humility and think, I'm going to fail. I'm going to flunk. I'm going to fall. I'm going to, make mistakes and start there and know that we all are. And if somebody's going to shame you for making a mistake, I mean, it's hard. I've been fearful of that too over the last, 5 years. I've been really terrified of that because it's not great. And we have these traumas in our bones of being, excommunicated or like whatever, just left behind. And we have abandonment issues. All of those are really real. And humanity is calling you up to do this work. So it's perhaps even starting there, looking at your internal biases, doing some of that unwinding work so that it softens within you. Because if you're still operating from a place of white supremacy where that inner oppressor and that inner white supremacist really is like up and really present in your bones and blood, then it's going to be really hard to move beyond that. So seeing how colonialism has affected us all, the patriarchy, white supremacy has affected us all, and starting there, and then always practicing as much gentleness as you can. I used to do these lives about appropriation. I used to say like, okay, let's all start and like take a breath, and then just take a breath first and like take a breath with compassion that we've messed up. Because if we are in defense, as we know, we are in freeze or we're in fight or in freeze, and we're just in this sort of, narrative of like, oh, I'm ready to like defend myself. You're not going to be open to hearing, to listening, to absorbing, to taking anything in when you are in this position. So I ask people to like roll their shoulders back, maybe open your heart, take a breath, reminding them you are safe. There's nobody coming to attack you. There's no tigers or anything coming to eat you. You're safe, right? Because our nervous systems get so rattled with these conversations. And it doesn't help that most of it's happening online, to be honest. It doesn't help that most of it's happening without context, without humanity, without heart. I always say if we had these conversations in a healing circle, in person, there would be much more gentleness and there would be much more ways to relate to one another. And that's just not the way it's been. So I want to say, like, there are reasons why you feel this way. There are reasons why it's terrifying. And how can you meet that challenge? How can you meet that invitation to do better? Because we all are invited to do that. I think there's not one of us that doesn't have the capability to do better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think we all have a role to play. And, I think I have a tendency to all of my friends feel like outsiders, like they felt like outsiders in some capacity. Like all of my friends are either marginalized or they have felt like they didn't fit, right? And I love that in your book, you talk about that. And one of the ways you describe it is called the spontaneous being. And I love that. I think that I would love to hear your thoughts on that because I think that kind of helps. I think for people, it's the humanity that is important. It is the stories of to bring us together. And if you feel like I don't know, it just kind of made me think of it just now because it's that spontaneous being. Like, anyway, I'd love to hear you talk about it.
The meaning of Anishinaabe is like the spontaneous being or the being like that came. So for our culture in particular, that's what one language keeper, Basil Johnson, how he would define that with his language, the way he'd express it was a spontaneous being, which was beautiful. And also the good being, which I think is interesting because I think we perceive that as being the good girl, the good boy, that's our conditioning as children to be good. But I think we all come here as divine and we're all returning to that. And I would love that's where my non-shaming approach probably comes from, is seeing the divine in everyone who sits in front of me and seeing the medicine that you have, no matter what you're shameful about. I remember people would come in with stories that they would be like, I've never shared those with anyone. Like that would happen over and over again. And I would think, oh, that's part of my medicine, I suppose, is just sitting in like the space where there's no shame and you can tell me anything and I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to hold you in your divinity because we're all human. And this is why we're here, to make mistakes and evolve and grow and learn. So I think it comes back to that true meaning probably of Anishinaabe, which is you came here as divine and you're going to leave as divine. And if you want to see yourself and beat yourself up your whole life and see yourself as bad or wrong or evil or any of those things, then it's kind of sad because really you're going to leave here, return to creation and remember that you're divine. So we might as well do that here and now.
I really love that, and that's such a beautiful teaching because I think that that kind of plays off the making mistakes and being a perfectionist. It's like when you realize that we are divine, and that's of course a lesson that we have to learn from your community because we've lost that we don't have to earn it, that we are worthy. And it's interesting because, you know, when we talked about the white woman letter, part of it was the entitlement of white women, right? And it was like feeling the worthiness. And it's interesting because I think I've been thinking a lot about why we have certain things and certain emotions and certain skills. And what I realized, it's like it's balance, right? You've got the balance and then you've got the imbalance. So a little bit of entitlement is okay, right? And you talk about this where it's like where it's you are allowed to have self-worth. You're allowed to realize that you can take up space, right? But when it goes into the overbalance or the imbalance, that's when it becomes a problem, right? So it's like, so how many things in our life, like emotions or practices, like it's where it's a balance issue, right? Like anger isn't a bad emotion. You don't have to be a good girl and put up with bad behavior when people are pushing your boundaries. You know, it's like, I think that that's where it kind of, I don't know. I've just been thinking a lot about that because I think that that's part of like what we've been talking about, you know, with white supremacy and the perfectionism and not wanting to make mistakes, and how that's kind of conditioned from colonialism. It's conditioned from Christianity. There's a lot of parts about that has been put on people. And so I love that your ancestry is like, it's you are worthy and you are divine, and kind of how to reclaim that because for so long you weren't able to actually do that, but that is actually your medicine, and that comes from your direct line, which I think is so beautiful. I don't know, what would you like to say about that?
Yeah, I think you said everything. I think that was just like a beautiful reflection. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I don't know. I adore you. And I think that there's just so much good stuff we can talk about. So I want to talk too about, we've talked a little bit about nature and the cycles. And I think for me, having had religious trauma, I have to kind of stay away from anything that's like organized, right? So for me, and I think too, in my ancestry, it's like, I have like Irish and things like that. So like working with the land and, you know, it's like working with the plants and things like that. That's in my heritage. But I think that that's probably also why I respond so well to Indigenous practices, because a lot of the practices from in my cells have also had to go underground, or, you know, it's like, and so I think that there's a lot of similarities in a lot of ways. So I think for me, like learning to learn about the cycles and the seasons. And I think for me, I've talked about before that I have a lot of fire energy and I have a lot of go, 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 which is probably why I have an autoimmune disease, because I had to learn how to slow down and I don't like it. And it's something that I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because someone who, like, from the outside, like you are able to manage it on the outside, no one I think would necessarily guess. But it's chronic illness is something that I think a lot of people have struggled with, and there isn't a lot of compassion for people that have chronic illness. And so I'd love to hear you talk about the cycles and how that shows up for you.
Yeah, it shows up every day. I think that I was on a podcast a couple months ago and it was really powerful for me. Somebody said, you know, this is a section of people that are always left behind. And I thought, oh, that's really true. Left behind in even the overculture of we need to grind and hustle and be in the sunshine all the time and creating and all of those things. And I think we've forgotten colonialism has impacted all of us, where we've forgotten our cyclical nature. And then if you have a chronic illness, you are constantly pushed into listening to your inner cycles and perhaps overriding them or bypassing them at times, because again, our culture doesn't make space for our ways of being, that we need more rest. We need to stop. We need to listen. So it's been a huge teaching of mine over having my business in particular for the last 20 years, where I say yes to things and I don't have the capacity for it. And I overwhelm myself and I burn myself out over and over again. It's one of those things. And I think there's a part of me, that entrepreneurial spirit, that loves what I do and is so lit up by it and just feels like this is my purpose. I'm here for it. And it doesn't always coincide with having a body that doesn't want to do all of those things, right? So sometimes it's grief around that, thinking, oh, I really wanted to do that and I don't have the capacity. My body won't let me. It's not always a case of, oh, I didn't want to do that. It's just like, I don't have the capacity to hold all of these things or all of these people. So it's been a constant teacher for me to learn how to rest, to learn how to listen to rest when it's calling me before I get burned out and sick. But I haven't been perfect at it. And I'm still learning because, again, my purpose and passion tend to sometimes override my body. And then it blows up in my face. So trying to balance that. For me, again, it's about boundaries. I think boundaries have been a huge teacher. So now when I get requests or things come my way, I have to really ask myself, like, give myself a day. Can I do this? Do I have the capacity for this? If I say no to this person, can I handle the disappointment on the other side? All of these things, because as my voice is getting bigger and bigger, I have to say no to way more things now than I ever have. So being really discerning with my time and energy has been a big teacher for me.
It's beautiful. I think I'm so like curious, like how you've been able to, because I think I'm terrible at this. Like I'm like very terrible at this. And it's one of those like where it's like I have so much I want to do and so many things that I want to do. And my body is just like it's one of those like I've had warnings because my mom got sick when I was 20 and she's still sick and she was in a wheelchair for a long time. And I think that that's probably why I know a lot about this, because when my mom was in a wheelchair, she was for about 10 years. People would only talk to me. Like when I would be pushing her around, they wouldn't talk to her. They would only talk to me. And I was like, she still has a brain. She still can talk to you, And I think that ableism is such a big problem that we don't really talk about. And I think, for people who have chronic illness who don't have like, it's not as noticeable. Like there's a lot of us out there too, it's like, and so like, how do you not beat yourself up? How do you deal with the grief? Like, how do you like, I think that that's kind of never, and I think that this is where the good girl stuff comes in and the perfectionist comes in too, because you're like, how I want to do all the things I want to, I don't want to like, I don't know. It's like, it's something that I'm still wrestling with. And I think one of the practices that I've taken from Indigenous practices is like touching grass with your bare feet. I use that all the time and it really helps me. And one of your cards that really helps me is like, one of them, it talks about like laying on the bare earth, like your back on the bare earth and just kind of like breathing into it. Do you have practices like for people who like, I've been in this space for a little while, it's like, but I think, my audience isn't really in the wellness space. Like, it's like, so for people who are new to this, what are some practices that, are something that they could use that are something that like would be an easy way to kind of like learn how to ground and learn how to rest and kind of give compassion to themselves for that?
I think it's anything that brings more presence to your body. And maybe perhaps it's building that relationship with your body when you've bypassed symptoms or when you've hustled past them or through them. Then it's a simple, okay, body, thank you for telling me that my knee is kind of hurting. The sensation is like a stabbing pain. Oh, I'm so sorry you're experiencing that. Like starting with those sensations. As a homeopath, that was the number one thing people couldn't do. I was always amazed. Well, what was the sensation? What's the feeling? Oh, it hurts. Okay, but what type of pain is it? It's like we don't even go deep enough to really assess that. It's just, it hurts and I'm going to move past it. It hurts, I'm going to take a Tylenol. It hurts, so I'm going to just hustle right through that. So bringing a slowness to that and bringing presence to that. And just as you said, I think standing on the land with bare feet is beautiful. Breathing practices are beautiful. I sometimes, if I'm really having a bad day, but I need to have a meeting or something, I will lie just flat on the couch for 2 minutes to tell my body, I hear you, I see you, I know you're exhausted. So I'm just going to like somatically remind myself that rest is coming tonight. But I'm going to give you this break because I know that you need that. And so I think those things are really important, but they're very simple. They're very simple. And I think listening is a skill that we need to practice because it's so easy to bypass our symptoms in our body when they're yelling at us.
Absolutely. It's so hard. It's so hard, but it's necessary because I think for me, it's like if I don't listen, my body will then force me to listen. And then it's like, well, now I have to cancel everything. It's like, and that's not good. So it's like, it's that balance, which I'm not particularly good at as a Libra. That's why I'm a Libra because I have to learn it. So I'd love to talk to you too about, because one of the rituals that I use daily is smoke medicine. And I think that that's something that is a closed practice, but something that a lot of people use anyway. And so I love in your book how you talk about like there are certain words that you use because you're part of the community. I use the word smoke medicine because I'm not Indigenous, but I'd love to hear you talk about smoke medicine because I think for me, um, I use it all the time, but I also want to make sure that I'm being respectful. And I know a lot of people use it and they don't know, like they don't actually know that they're being like irresponsible or irreverent or, it's like, so yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I love starting with this conversation with I'm not the smudge police. So, you can do whatever the heck you want because I'm not out there kind of telling people to stop doing what they're doing. I think there's just in my book, there's a really clear list of how you can be appreciative of our culture and not appropriative. So I do recommend everybody gets that because it's like a really clear, this is what you do. This is what you can do. And again, because I live in the nuance, it's not always that black and white. But I would say, first of all, you need way less sage than you think you do. You can use one little piece, right, to clear a whole home, really. Develop a relationship with that medicine. If that's the medicine that really speaks to you and you have a relationship with it, then who am I to say that you can't use it? However, there are many medicines that you can use for smoke medicine that are probably connected to your lineage and culture. But if you still want to use something like Palo Santo or sage, find out where you're getting it from. Do not buy it from Sephora or these places that have kits right for sale. Like go get it from an Indigenous source. Ask your local new age store where they're getting it from. Are they making reparations to these communities? Can you make reparations to these communities? Can you uplift Indigenous voices? There's so many ways that you can give back. And you think, but that's silly. How is that related to me lighting my smudge stick? It really is because it's that energetic exchange saying, I see what is wrapped up in this. This is your original medicine. I'm going to borrow it and I'm going to use it for a beautiful ceremony and ritual. That's great. Now, how can I acknowledge the power of this? And how can I build a relationship with the communities that this comes from? So those are my suggestions. There's many more too, but I think that's what I would say. And some Indigenous people would say you're absolutely not allowed to use it. So please stop. So it just depends on who you talk to. I know that me saying those things isn't going to stop people. They're going to use it no matter what. So I'd rather them use it with reverence, respect, and reciprocity.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that kind of brings it back to being a bridge because, I was thinking about it and, I work in media and it's like, and because of the things having to go underground, how much has been lost over the years because you weren't able to practice your own medicines. And like, and what is the balance like that like living in the and where like you want those practices to survive. And so as more and more people are not living on like the reservation and things like that, and as the communities are, growing online, like how do we bridge that gap? Because I love that you're a bridge because you're able to, I think it's that nuance, right? Because if things are going to be used anyway, how do you do it with reverence? How do you do it with honor to where it comes from? And it comes down to gratitude. And I think that that's something that my hope is that people will start doing that. And I think too, your book is really, really excellent at explaining it. And I love that you can use things like rosemary and rose, and there's lots of like things that you have listed in your book. So everybody buy the book. But in terms of, I know we have only a few more minutes. So I wanted to talk to you about, you're part of my project, Siren Song. And I would really love to talk to you about your legacy for this lifetime. Because Siren Song, for those that don't know, it's women and women identifying who are using their voice to make the world a better place. Women who are disruptors, who are trailblazers, who are trying to make a difference in the world. So for you, what would you say your legacy, and usually people, it's like your passion and purpose, like how that connects. Like, but what would you say your legacy for this lifetime is?
Mm. I love that question. I always see it as a vision because I have two children who I feel are expressing themselves and living out in bodies that don't carry the same trauma that I did. So I'm really seeing that I broke a lot of that, and I'm the one that's healed a lot of that. Of course, they have many things to heal in their own lives, but to birth perhaps a new way of being where Indigenous beings can feel that wholeness with not having to reclaim and remember so much and go back, where they feel excited about who they are, and they're pure medicine keepers, and that's what they want to share with the world. So that's what I see. It's very easy when you have children to feel about your legacy because you're feeling directly what you're implanting and putting forward with them. But I would love to dream a world into being that is more kind. I know that sounds kind of cheesy sometimes, but I really want to leave behind a more kinder world with my work, and perhaps cracking some hearts open towards a more compassionate way of relating to each other.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I think you can do it. I mean, it's your voice. It's I think really powerful. And I think because you have such a loving heart, you can feel that through the words. Like even when you set boundaries, you're still like very, very kind and very loving. So I think if anyone can do it, it's you.
Oh, thank you.
What advice would you give yourself as either a child, a teenager, or even 10 years ago?
I think I would have told her that it's safe to set boundaries, that it's safe to disappoint people, and it's safe to, and other people's emotions or reactions to you aren't your responsibility to take on.
That's really good advice. That's super, super good advice. Would you envision yourself in 5 years?
I was thinking today about how happy and grateful I am to be where I am at right now. I really feel really aligned in those ways. I have another book I'm writing the proposal now. So in 5 years, I'd love to see it moving around the world in really beautiful and big ways, perhaps like braiding sweetgrass. That's like my dream, because her book is beautiful and brilliant.
It's a beautiful book. Yeah.
But that would be amazing. And just continuing to create. So perhaps another Dex in the world, and continuing speaking. I love speaking engagements right now. It's my favorite thing to do. It's lighting me up. So stages, being on there, sharing my medicine with ease and love and all the things. And also I'd like to see myself more well in my physical body.
I love that. Part of the gift of this podcast is I want it to be a time capsule. So it's like, so we can look back in 5 years and be like, we set this intention and look what happened. It's like, I think that's kind of the beautiful part about it. But it's also beautiful to like, actually quite a few people have been like, oh, I'm happy with how things are now. And I'm like, that's wonderful. I mean, that's success, right? If you're happy with how things are. But I also like to set the intentions of like where it might go too. So we have that to look back on. Too. Yeah. Well, thank you, Asha. I want everyone to be able to find you. We'll put everything in the show notes, but if you want to like say kind of some of the things, like where can people find you? How can people buy your books, your oracle cards? Like we'll list everything too, but just so they can hear from you.
So you can follow me on Instagram. It's asha.frost. My website's ashafrost.com. I'm on TikTok as well, if you want to follow me there. Following does really help me, especially as an author, because it really helps the publishers, see that I'm worthy of investing in. And also pre-orders. So I have my new deck coming out December 3rd. If you want to pre-order my deck, that also helps me immensely. It's an animal spirit deck, and the artwork is beautiful by a local artist, Holly Pichette. So please do that if you're interested in any of my work.
Fantastic. Well,
and you can get my books and cards. You can get my books and cards anywhere books and cards are sold.
Perfect. Well, it has been such a delight, Asha. Is there anything else that we like that you'd want to leave, like any like final last words? All right. I know I did a lot of the talking.
I think that we went wide and deep. Okay, so good. I think that's great. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was such a delight. Thank you so much, Asha. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing so much of your wisdom. And it's been such an honor. This is a dream of mine fulfilled. So thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Oh, thank you, Brittany.
And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, which I hope you did, please subscribe. And if you would like to leave a review, you may or may not get name dropped in the next episode. We love to reward a gold star at the end. I'm a gold star girl myself. All right. If you'd like to follow along with my socials, Brittany Ambridge across the board. And my website is the same. And then the credits, we have beautiful cover art by Stephanie Brookler, and my producer, big thanks to him, Juan Paulini Diaz.